Over-explaining doesn't happen because you're unclear. It happens because you're trying to manage someone else's reaction. Most people think they explain more because they want to be understood, but that's not the real reason. They explain because they're trying to prevent discomfort, disappointment, pushback, conflict. Explaining becomes a way to soften the moment, not clarify it. And that's where the problem starts. Because the moment you begin explaining, you shift the interaction. It stops being a decision and becomes a negotiation. At first, it feels harmless. You add context, you offer reasoning, you clarify your intention. But the other person doesn't hear clarity. They hear an opening. They hear something they can respond to. And once there's something to respond to, the boundary is no longer the boundary. The conversation is. This is how over-explaining trains people to push back. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but structurally. You teach people what parts of you are flexible by what you explain. When you explain why, you invite debate. When you explain how long, you invite bargaining. When you explain what led you here, you invite reinterpretation. And suddenly, the focus isn't your limit anymore. It's whether your reason is good enough. Most people don't realize this is happening in real time. They feel it afterward. They feel drained, second-guessing, annoyed with themselves. They think, I shouldn't have said all that. But by then, the damage is already done. Because the other person learned something important. They learned that if they push a little, you'll offer more. They learned that your first answer isn't your final one. They learned that persistence works. This is why some people seem to always argue your boundaries, even when you're calm, even when you're reasonable, even when you're kind. It's not because you're bad at setting boundaries, it's because your explanations taught them where the pressure points are. Over-explaining creates a pattern, and patterns train behavior. If every boundary comes with a paragraph, people expect a paragraph. If every no comes with justification, people wait for justification. And when you stop explaining one day, they feel entitled to question it because they weren't trained to respect the boundary. They were trained to engage the explanation. This is where people start to feel manipulated, even when no one is manipulating. The dynamic itself does the work. One person keeps offering information, the other keeps responding to it. And slowly, the boundary becomes something that has to be defended. That's the moment most people miss. Boundaries don't need defense. They need follow-through. But follow-through only works when the boundary stands on its own. The quieter the boundary, the harder it is to push against, because there's nothing to grab onto, no reasoning to pick apart, no tone to critique, no logic to counter, just a decision. This is uncomfortable at first, especially for people who were rewarded for being agreeable, or praised for being accommodating, or taught that clarity equals kindness. But clarity is not the same as explanation. Clarity is knowing what you're available for. Explanation is trying to make that availability palatable. And when you confuse the two, you end up doing emotional labor for other people's reactions. The shift happens when you notice the moment you feel tempted to explain more. That moment usually comes right after resistance. A pause, a question, a sigh, can you just tell me why? That's the fork in the road. You can either reinforce the pattern or end it. Ending it doesn't require firmness, it requires restraint. It looks like stopping after the sentence, letting the silence do the work, letting the other person feel their response without managing it. That's where real boundaries start, not in what you say, but in what you don't add. Because the less you explain, the less there is to push against. And eventually, people stop pushing. Not because they suddenly understand you better, but because there's nothing left to negotiate.